Hello, everybody, and welcome. Let me just see a show of hands. How many of you have had a patient safety course in your medical school or residency? Good. Very good. Well, that's a new trend. Last year, I think there were only internally Hopkins-trained people who we saw had one, so this is delighting. I will say to you that the application of the material that you're going to hear in this session, and hopefully you retain some of it, will have by far the biggest impact on your patients over your career than any new discovery or gene, so I heed you pay attention. This is the MRI scan of a surgeon in training. She woke up one morning with tingling in her hands and a headache and went to get a CAT scan which showed a tumor. And then she had an MRI scan, a functional MRI, which measured the blood flow in her brain, as you're probably aware of these scans. So she curled her hand so that she wouldn't lose her hand function. And what they found is that where they were going to cut would have destroyed the use of her hand. So they went through a longer section of brain, though less active, and she woke up without any defects. I mean, this is an example of the true miracles that biomedical science has delivered and that you will use. And yet, this same U.S. healthcare system can't get the technology right to prevent leaving a sponge in a patient. Right? And it seems to be so contrasting to say, here you have this most amazing discovery that we've sequenced the human genome, we put in artificial hearts, we've nearly cured childhood leukemias. But we make an awful lot of mistakes. We make mistakes such that on average 50% of patients get the evidence that they're supposed to in this country, including for some cases here. Well over 100,000, probably closer to 200,000 or 300,000 people die each year from preventable harm. And so how do we reconcile that? Well, I think there's two things for you to think about that. One is that we fail to view the delivery of healthcare as science. The delivery of healthcare has to date been an art. You find genes, you find therapies, but then how you deliver them, it's up to you. You be creative and you're an art. And that has been a disaster. It's why we have this many people being harmed. But perhaps the second and more fundamental for you is we have to admit that we're fallible. That one of the conundrums of medicine is that it's a field that grew up with heroism, and the heroism has led to an awful lot of discoveries. But that heroism really hinders us in trying to design safe systems because we still believe we can be perfect. And until we admit that we're going to make a mistake, we'll never design systems to catch those mistakes. It's what the fundamental reason why aviation has become safety is they admitted they're going to be tired, they're going to pull the wrong knob, and so they still do that an awful lot, but they catch it. In healthcare, we have a really, really poor history of doing that. We do in my field. I'm a professor in anesthesiology and critical care, and we used to kill an awful lot of people each year from hooking the wrong gases together in the back of the anesthesia machine. So we would hook oxygen to nitrous oxide. We can't do that anymore because we changed the shape of the connectors. They physically don't fit together. And yet, every year in this hospital and around the world, we harm someone from putting a pulmonary artery catheter, a Swan-Ganz catheter, in too far in the neck. And we know that if that catheter is in beyond 60 centimeters, it's a risk for rupturing the pulmonary artery. And you would think that if we bought this concept that we're imperfect, we would put a hub at 60 that says, stop, think about it, you're probably in too far, but we don't. And the reason we don't, I think, is fundamentally because we still think we can be perfect, that we can beat the odds, that we know better. And until we accept that, we're not going to make much progress. Now, the harm from safety is real. The numbers, I think, are almost numbing. This is a little girl who could be a picture of my daughter. They're both born around the same time, but it's not. It's a little girl, Josie King, who died here of preventable mistakes. Essentially, she died of dehydration, a third world disease in the world's best hospital that you'll be practicing at. And we have to say, how could we prevent this from ever happening again? And I think once you accept that you're fallible, and hopefully you accept that, I want to put forth to you, there's 4 key concepts of safety that you need to keep in your head as you practice medicine. And they're nothing esoteric, they're in some ways relatively mundane. The first is we have to get away from this idea that personal performance or my own effort drives everything, but rather what drives things is the system. And there's this quote in business and quality that says every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. So let's think about that. I'm a runner, and I train for marathons, and I have a time that I do for marathons. And my time is a product of the system that I do to train. And some of that is genetic, I can't change. Some of that's my environment. Some of that is my personal effort and my personal responsibility. Some of it's my size and height. Some of it's how hard I train in the schedule I have training. Some of it's how many hours I spend in this place. But together, that system determines what my performance is going to be. And if I want to improve, I'm going to have to change pieces of that. What we've done in healthcare is we think that that personal effort controls everything. And in some sense, we're really, really blessed to have that because we have people like you and nurses in the hospital and doctors who really care deeply. I mean, there's this overwhelming value of benevolence in healthcare. The problem is it's not very effective if that's the only thing you do to change a system. The second thing is I want you to understand some really basic principles of safe design. Really basic. And they are standardize when you could, create independent checks when things or checklists to make sure you do things that are important. And when things go wrong, rather than chucking them off as the way they are, have a way to learn from them. The next idea is to understand that those principles don't just apply to your technical work. They apply, perhaps more importantly, to your teamwork. And we'll go through each of these in detail. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly for you as interns, to recognize that healthcare is a team sport. And there's overwhelming evidence that teams make wise decisions when there's diverse and independent input. So speak up, listen to the nurses, listen to the patients. If you're an attending, listen to others, because you're ultimately going to make a wiser decision the more lenses you have. So let's dive into each of these. I gave you my training example. I want to give you an example from healthcare. We published this in the Annals of Internal Medicine. There was a fellow pulled a catheter, a dialysis catheter, out of a patient's neck when they were in the sitting position. The patient suffered an air embolism and arrested. And so the initial review of that case was, that stupid resident, why'd you pull the catheter in their sitting? We know we're not supposed to. And essentially scold him or encourage him to do better. But teasing apart the systems and saying, well, what is the other pieces that might play into this? Training, supervision, sleep deprivation, teamwork. Turns out that fellow was never trained in how to pull these catheters. And we had no certification program to ensure that they were competent to do this. We had a see one, do one, teach one mentality, which is a system that's perfectly designed to produce air embolisms. And the nurse was really uncomfortable because she knew that we never pull these catheters sitting, but we didn't have a written protocol to back her, and she didn't want to speak up and criticize the physician because the last time she did it, she got her head bit off and just said, it's not really, I don't want to be put in that situation again, so she stayed silent. And as a result, we have a patient who suffered an air embolism. And what I think this case is so nice to say, what looks simple as a, quote, dumb doc or as a physician mistake is essentially the physician was set up, that they worked in a system that wasn't adequately preparing them. Now, if the physician wasn't comfortable, they also have that personal effort in training to say, no, 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 I'm not competent. I got to make sure I do this. Please keep an eye on me. And so that doesn't leave personal responsibility off the hook, but personal responsibility is one system of many. Now, these system factors, you could think of them as nested, and there's no right taxonomy, but what we want you to be able to have is lenses to think of, okay, is there something with this patient that makes them at risk? Is there something with the task that either I'm not clear or the procedure's not clear? Is there something with the teamwork, with the way we're working out? Is there something with the individual providers? Is there something with the work environment? It's noisy, it's distracting, it's dirty. And is there something with an institution? And each of these could either defend against or contribute to harm, but for the most part, we're invisible to them. There's as you know, Hopkins 24/7 is airing again tonight. In the last one, some of you may have seen, or you were younger, 8 years ago, I think, there was an M&M conference that so elegantly showed what's great about American healthcare and what could be improved. It was an M&M conference of a surgeon in training discussing a case where a patient had a delayed transport, a trauma patient from the ED to the OR. And he's sitting there literally shaking. He was so nervous. And his response to the question, what are you going to do next time, was, I'm going to push harder. Right? That immense sense of personal responsibility. I'm going to push harder. But what that shows is that he was system myopic, like many of us, because he can try to push harder, but unless he has security go down to get the elevator for him, or talks to all the other people and creates a system to make sure when the trauma beeper goes off, someone holds the elevator and it stays hold until we make a go, no-go decision to the operating room, pushing harder is likely to result in screaming and a tantrum, and unfortunately not very productive. And so we need to begin to develop these lenses. Some of the work that we've done looks at staffing levels. So staffing, both having, in this case, intensivists in the ICU, having more nurses, are all system factors that predict performance. What your goal needs to be is to have the lenses to try to see these systems in the midst of working. Now, the one thing on that funnel that seems to be critically important in healthcare is that team level. And we learned a lot of this from aviation. We learned a lot of it now from our own Sentinel events. But this is a slide of aviation safety over time, and every time I fly, I'm thankful for how safe it is. But when you think about what made these improvements, what's often not known is that the improvements up to maybe 1971 were due to the jet engine. It fails much less often. It's just a technically better system. But the improvements from 70 onwards really had nothing to do with technology. Nothing. They had to do with the way the pilots and the co-pilots played in the cockpit together, because the voice cockpit recorder of several crashes sounded something very similar to that Air Florida crash that went into the icy Potomac River. You were probably young then, maybe 15 years ago. You remember those really dramatic pictures of firefighters plucking people out of the icy Potomac River in December after that crash. Well, it was a snowy day in December. The flight's going down the runway, or about to go down the runway, and the co-pilot starts talking to the pilot, and here's what the cockpit recorder sounded like. Captain, wings are boggy. Captain, wings have ice on them. They're driving down the runway. Captain, we're slow on approach. Captain, we're slow on approach. Captain, not going to clear takeoff. Captain, abort takeoff. Captain, abort takeoff. Captain, we're going down. 7 admonitions from a really scared co-pilot to a pilot that fell on deaf ears. So the National Transportation Safety Board got really concerned and said, we either have selected out a lot of deaf pilots or we have a big cultural issue here. So they brought pilots and co-pilots in to simulate, and what they found was that in the majority of the cases, the pilots never heard the co-pilots. And so they dug in further, and what they found is that they had a really hierarchical culture. What pilots or co-pilots had to say wasn't valued, and they weren't listened to. Now, in our case, most of our Sentinel events in this country and in our hospital are due to communication errors. And we've made some remarkable strides, but yet 4 years ago when we started, we're thank God, making difference now. When I went and spoke to some of the services to say, I think it's important that the nurses round with the team, I was looked at like I'm crazy. You say, I can't understand why you wouldn't want them. The new nurses are going to execute the plan that you make. You need to be on the same page. And the thought was, we're physicians. What does a nurse need to be there for? And essentially, they were being like the Air Florida crash. So how do you defend against these? Well, I want to give you these 3 basic principles. Standardize, create independent checks, and when things go wrong, learn from them. And what do we mean by learning from them? Well, it's frankly, if you can answer 4 really simple questions. What happened? Why did it go wrong? So what are the systems that were vulnerable? What would you fix? And how would you do it? Now, you will see defects every day in your work areas. The challenge for you is if you're going to have the courage to say, okay, I'm going to just accept that I work in them, or at least some of them I'm going to begin to fix. Let me give you some examples of standardization. So you may know the CDC has recommendations for placing central lines. And part of those recommendations are to use a cap, gown, and mask, gloves, full barrier drape. There's about 8 things you need. Well, several years ago, we found that our docs had to go to 8 different places to get all those. It was a system that was perfectly designed to have a performance compliance of about 30%, which is what it was nationally. You'd go to get gloves, oh, they're not there. I ask the nurse to get you some. You go to get a cap, it's not stocked. You're really busy, so predictably, you're going to go without it. So a simple idea of standardization, we said, okay, let's make a cart that stores all the equipment you need to place a central line in one place. Make it easy for the docs. You go there, you get everything you need, take 8 steps to 1, performance improves. Perhaps the greatest example of standardization, and in this case, simplification or of eliminating unnecessary steps, is the ATM machines. As you know, there's some ATM machines that you put your card in, it keeps it, you get your money back, and it spits your card out. And the banking industry has a huge problem with those kinds of machines because they have a defect rate of leaving your card behind that's quite high. I think it's like 1 in 300 or 400 encounters, and it costs them about $500 to reprocess your thing. It costs an awful lot of money. So what did they do to change the design? They now have a system that the card never leaves your hands. Right? You swipe the card, I don't have to put it in, I then get my money. Right? The workflow was simplified. I took out that step of taking it out, and the defect rate was reduced by 1,000-fold, right? Because you don't leave your card there anymore. They eliminated that possibility. The idea of independent checks is you probably know those annoying signals from your car if you don't buckle your seatbelt. But what underlies that? It says, we're fallible, we're going to forget. The evidence that you should buckle your seatbelt is overwhelming, but we're busy, we're rushed, we forget. And this says if you don't put it in and click, you get that really annoying sound that it's effective. Right? But we do that far too often for things that are mission critical. So you have a heart attack, and did you get your aspirin and beta blocker? Or all the evidence-based interventions that you were learning about in your training to now to make sure we have that. One of the ahas for doing this work is to have not only physicians be the police for this. So what do I mean by that? Well, we created a checklist for placing central venous catheters. And it's really simple 5-point checklist. Wash your hands, clean your skin with a soap called chlorhexidine, use barrier precautions, remove unnecessary lines, and avoid the femoral site if you could. But we weren't doing that very often. So we went to the nurses and said, nurses, when we place these lines, we want you to ensure that our docs comply with these evidence things. And if they don't, docs, go back and fix the defect. If you didn't wash your hands, wash them. If you don't have a gown on, go get one. And when we first launched this, you would have thought we're causing World War III. The nurses said, it's not my job to police the residents, and if I do, I'm going to get my head bit off. The residents said, there is no way you could have a nurse question me in public. It makes me look like I don't know something, right? That mental model of we expect perfection, to which I said, you know, it's okay, welcome to the human race. You don't know everything, and you're not expected to. But the evidence wasn't the debate, it was the teamwork. So we pulled everyone together and said, is it tenable that we harm patients at Johns Hopkins? And of course, the answer was no. And they said, then how could you as a nurse sit there silently and seeing someone not washing their hands? It's just not tenable. You have to speak up. At the same time, I don't want you to get your head bit off, so docs, if you give the nurses flack, nurses page me, this isn't going to be tolerated. You have to make sure we're advocating for the patient. Now, the reality is we've never been paged. Our rates are ridiculously low, but we created a system of an independent check where we work together as a healthcare team. And those examples are far too few. Here's just some data of how our rates of infections at Hopkins from doing that. And then some of you may have seen this New England Journal publication where we took this program and put it in a whole state. Really simple application of checklists and virtually eliminated these infections in the whole state of Michigan. Really profound results. Now, so you got these principles of standardization and independent checks. Make sure you adhere that they don't just apply to putting catheters in, but they apply to how you communicate. There's this really simple model of communication that we all use that is that when I'm sending a message to you, I encode some meaning of that. And it passes through some pretty noisy environments often, and you as the receiver try to decode what I'm saying. And if we know each other really well, there'll unlikely be a translation error. So when I come home often after a day of work, I'll say to my wife, oh boy, it was a busy day at work, I'm really tired. And she decodes that and says, well, Peter, what you're really saying is you want to go for a run and not give the kids a bath, right? And she's absolutely correct. But in work, that's often poses problems. So for instance, we would give a nurse an order in the ICU to say, okay, they can leave when their vital signs are stable. Now, how do you decode that? Well, who knows? Or hold the tube feeds if the patient's not tolerating them. I did this little experiment once where that was an order on rounds, and there were about 8 people around, and I asked everyone to take out a piece of paper and define how you, or write down how you define not tolerating tube feeds. And as you'd predict, there's 8 different answers. And it's not that any one is necessarily right or wrong, though in some cases there is, but you're going to have a translation error. You're going to have a defect, because if I have something in my head that I think it's 150 cc's and it's not, I haven't communicated that to the nurse or the staff who's going to do that, they may interpret it the wrong way with no malintention, but we'll miscommunicate. There's some fascinating data about the disconnect between teamwork amongst physicians and nurses. And this is just ICU data. It happens to be in every healthcare area. And what it shows is that when you match people who work together in an area, so you could be in an OB, in a peds clinic, in a general medicine clinic, in a radiology suite, in an OR, that doctors and nurses who work together, when you ask them how good of teamwork is, doctors uniformly say it's great, nurses say it stinks. Now you think about that. These are people, we're on the same team supposedly, working together, and how is that? And we don't know for sure, but I think what it is that in some sorts we as physicians may need to recalibrate our view of teamwork, because I'm a inbred product of this medical school and training program and public health school. But I can tell you, I graduated medical school here believing good teamwork is I give an order and a nurse takes it. And if that happens, we're a team. I then thought in my training, boy, I'm really good teamwork. At the end of rounds, I'll ask the nurse if they have any comments, kind of as a pat suggestion. Right? My view of teamwork now is radically different, where we're discussing and making plans along. The nurse is giving input of what he or she sees going on. It's a very, very different model than we grew up with. There's a number of teamwork tools that you can do. I think by far the most important one for you is to make sure the nurses are on rounds with you. It's absurd that you make plans and the people who are going to carry out that plans aren't there to do it, so you will predictably have a translation error. The second key area for you to think about communication errors is in your handoffs, and they are exceedingly vulnerable. And you've all probably done handoffs as medical school or your residency. If your fellow's scribbling notes on a piece of paper, it's absurd the way we do handoffs. And each of you in your departments will have different core data elements of what you need. But fundamentally, in any industry, and perhaps the 9/11 Commission report told us this best, there's three key items for any handoff. And the first is, what do I need to know? So what is this patient? And that may just be a 30,000 foot for a handoff, post-op day 5 from a gallbladder. What do I need to do? So what's the task list? And then importantly, and perhaps most importantly, what are you worried about? So what's your gut that this patient just doesn't look right, or their urine output's been down, or the kid's breathing fast? Get those three critical components, however you structure your handoffs, to make sure you don't have those kind of errors. Okay, the last concept that I want you to get, so you have lenses to see systems. You have some basic principles of standardization and independent checks to make them safe. You know you have to put those principles to how you communicate. And the last is understanding that teams make wise decisions with diverse and independent input. So let me give you an example. I can't tell you the number of times I've been on rounds where the nurse knew a piece of information but didn't speak up because there was no forum, or they were afraid to ask. Or, importantly, we had a patient in the ICU the other day that had normal coags, was bleeding. We thought it was surgical bleeding. We were making plans to go back. The medical students kind of tapped me on the shoulder, and I, really busy, said, hey, I got to go put a line in. We're resuscitating this patient. And he backed off, kind of got a little more encouragement and said, hey, Peter, this guy's platelets dropped to 20 on the last lab value, right? Would have completely missed that really critical piece of information that changed management had we not spoken up. And so make sure that you get as many lenses as possible. For those of you who go on to be attendings, the reality is that doesn't take away any authority being a decision maker, right? I, as the attending in the ICU, or when I'm attending in the OR, fundamentally you have to make a decision. But I'm much more likely to make a wiser decision if I say, or the nurse says what he or she thinks going on, the students do, the residents do, and we ultimately do that. The second point of key decision making, and we probably spend $40 million a year in lawsuits from not having this happening, is this ability to go between divergent and convergent thinking. What do I mean by that? So divergent thinking is what happens typically, I won't pick on medicine, but mostly in medical rounds, right? It's brainstorming. You throw out all these great ideas, maybe it could be this, maybe it could be that. And it's a really important point of understanding what's going on. Convergent thinking is then taking that and say, okay, this is what our plan is. We're going to do specifically this, this, and this today. And what we've seen is that in any field, that ability to alternate between convergent and divergent is the key to wise decision making. So I make a plan that, in the case of that little girl, attending saw her in the morning, she looks fine, everything looks great, and she does, but she got sicker in the day. The nurses said, oh, she's sicker, she's sicker, she's sicker. But many of the team said, but we saw her, she's fine, we're on this convergent, and there wasn't that ability to take back and saying, okay, I got a new piece of data in my head, and I need to then say, does my plan still really apply now because something looks like it changed? And that is so hard to do because you're really, really busy. And you're going to be busy. But trying to keep that in mind, the idea of being on the dance floor and getting up to the balcony to see what's going on, getting to the dance floor, getting up to the balcony. The kind of metaphor for this idea of the wisdom of crowds that I will leave you with is this idea of don't play man down. Hopkins is a big lacrosse school. If you haven't been indoctrinated into lacrosse, you likely will be. But at the national championship last year, Hopkins was playing Duke. We were up by 4 goals with 2 minutes left. Hopkins got a penalty. In lacrosse, when you get a penalty, you play man down, which means you go into a penalty box and you're short one player. It's a silly way to play. You're disadvantaged. And Duke, within 30 seconds, scored 3 goals. Luckily, Hopkins stayed on to win, but that penalty almost cost them the game. And I think about what we do in healthcare, and we volitionally play man down every day. Volitionally, because we don't ask the patients, hey, what do you think's going on, or impedes the parents or your other staff members, and the stakes are too darn high, far higher than a national lacrosse championship. So I encourage you not to play man down. So what is your role that we'd like to leave you with? Well, as you get to the wards, I think you can start to try to develop lenses to see systems. And just think about one process you do, one procedure, one diagnosis, and walk along and see how might I do this better? Where are the risks of this going wrong, and how could you build them into your training programs? I think whenever you could apply these principles of standardization, checklists, and learning from mistakes, you should infuse them into your training programs, infuse them into your work rounds. The culture here strongly welcomes trainee input into this work, and frankly, it's essential because you're the eyes and ears closest to the patient, and importantly, work to share what you've learned. Some really concrete things for your role: that whenever you enter and leave a room, make sure you wash your hands. There's no doubt we kill many, many people in this country a year from our failure to do that. So that's a really key thing. As I said, encourage the nurses to round with you. We just put on one of the surgical floors, having the nurses round and agree on what explicitly is it going to take for this patient to leave. And our measure of success was how many pages the residents get a day. It's an important measure. We have other measures, but if it didn't make work less, it wouldn't work. We went from 65 pages a day to the resident service to 2. Right? Why? Because we communicated early on, clearly developed a plan, and dramatically reduced everyone's workload. And then importantly, don't play man down. You'll make better decisions, and you'll have an awful lot more joy in your work if you do. As I said, the stakes are quite high. The mother of this little girl, it's actually a remarkable story, has worked with the hospital to help improve safety. And on the 4-year anniversary of her dying, she came to the hospital and looked us in the eye and said, "Could you tell me that she's less likely to die now than she was 4 years ago?" You know, and the sad reality is, I couldn't. I told her all the stuff we were doing, but we didn't really have a good way to measure safety. That we've changed a lot now. I believe we could do that. And importantly, I hope if she or one of your other patients asks what you're doing to make care safe, to reduce harm, you could look them in the eye and give them a clear answer. So, welcome to Hopkins, and thank you.